What would you do if you saw a black woman wearing a plain cotton coat, standing in the middle of the first-class cabin on a commercial flight, and being asked to leave her seat by a flight attendant simply because she didn't look like she belonged? Would you follow the crowd's gaze, or would you look at her humanity? And what if I told you that woman not only belonged there, she was the founder of the entire airline? This isn't a story about a plane ticket. This is a story about how a person, misjudged and dismissed, stood up and forced an entire industry to relearn how to see people. Her name is Danielle Monroe, and what happened in just 9 minutes inside that first-class cabin changed forever the way we understand power, silence, and courage. Denver International Airport, Gate D14, a typical Monday afternoon like thousands of others across the American aviation system. Electronic announcements beeped with the rhythm of a digital heartbeat, and passengers stood in line with the weary expressions of people long accustomed to being ignored, unless they were wearing a suit or flashing a metallic priority pass. The Vista Blue Airlines Boeing 787 rested quietly at the gate like a steel whale waiting to swallow a chaotic crowd, and at exactly 3:47 p.m., a black woman stepped onto the jet bridge wearing a beige blouse, dark slacks, carrying a small laptop bag and a bottle of water. There was nothing unusual about her. No Rolex watch, no VIP boarding tag hanging from her neck, no air of entitlement associated with luxury lounges. She simply looked natural, determined, walking swiftly but not hurriedly. Her name was Danielle Rhodes. As Danielle entered the first-class cabin and gently placed her bag in seat 2A, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Not loud, but cold enough to make the air vibrate, like the click of a safety lock in a tense boardroom. A voice spoke from behind. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You might be confused. That's a first-class seat." She turned. Standing before her was Captain William Steele, a white man with sun-tanned skin and eyes that didn't smile. And before she could respond, he delivered another blow. "And respectfully, you're not exactly what we call first-class material." No one laughed, but no one spoke either. 13 passengers already seated in the cabin went silent, as if the plane had switched to silent mode. A chill spread through the air, as if the cold wasn't just from the air conditioning, but from a familiar prejudice. Who deserves and who doesn't? Danielle tilted her head slightly. No reaction, no words. But that silence made Captain Steele believe he had won. "We've had some economy passengers wander in before," he said. "Sometimes folks get confused when they see a big seat." Then he turned to lead flight attendant Jessica Moore, who was standing near the cabin door. "Can you please verify this guest boarding class?" Jessica, a blonde woman in a silver-blue uniform, immediately lifted the microphone and made an announcement in a flat but clearly intentional tone. "Passenger in 2A, please step aside for ticket verification. You may be in the wrong section." And just like that, within seconds, every eye in the first-class cabin was fixed on Danielle, as if she had just crashed a millionaires-only dinner party. She said nothing, just opened her bag and took out her boarding pass, handed it straight to Jessica. The flight attendant glanced at it quickly, too quickly to really read it, then frowned. "This looks possibly altered." She turned to another attendant. "Check economy." She may have slipped past. Her voice was full of suspicion, but the suspicion wasn't about the document. It was about the person holding it. A passenger across the aisle, Allison Meyer, whispered to her friend, "That doesn't feel right." And they began recording. Danielle remained still, her face calm, neither angry nor smug. But if one looked closely, her fingers were slightly clenched at her side. Her silence wasn't submission. It was a warning. Jessica narrowed her eyes. "Ma'am, we need to confirm this with our manifest. Can you step into the galley?" Danielle responded by opening her wallet and handing over a card. A Crescent Executive Pass. A hard silver card with her name embossed on it. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Wow, good print job. But you can't just make one of these. We've had forgeries before." Behind William Steele, a tall white man named Miles Whitmore, gray suit, silk tie, glossy Italian shoes, shook his head in disapproval. He said nothing, but his look was loud and clear. Someone like her shouldn't be here. Danielle caught that look. She didn't need to hear it. She still said nothing. But the shame of her past spoke for her. At 22, Danielle had boarded a business-class flight wearing a hoodie, a ticket bought with all her savings after graduation. They'd asked her 3 times, "Are you sure you're not in the wrong seat?" That time, she just bowed her head. But after that day, she founded Vista Blue Airlines. And today, on a plane owned by the airline she created, she was asked again, "Are you sure you belong here?" Seat 2A was no longer just a seat. It was a provocation. Danielle looked directly at Steele. "Captain Steele," she said softly, "you're making a mistake." Jessica jumped in. "And what gives you the right to sit here?" Danielle silently flipped the back of the executive pass. Embossed in silver, Danielle Rhodes, Chief Executive Officer, Vista Blue Global Holdings. No one had time to react. Jessica snatched the card, glanced at it, then tossed it onto the seat beside her like a used coupon. Anybody can fake that. But Chris Daniels, Allison's companion, picked it up and read it out loud. A passenger gasped, "Wait, did she say CEO?" And for the first time, the cabin went quiet for a different reason: shock. Jessica stayed defiant. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll call security." Danielle didn't move. She just pulled out her phone and dialed, "Tamara, initiate protocol. Begin internal capture." The voice on the other end replied instantly, "Already logging? Ready when you are." Danielle pressed her lips together, her eyes turning cold. And that was when the real story began. Danielle Rhodes remained still at seat 2A, where the air had begun to freeze. Not just from the AC, but from the commanding officer's condescending stare. Inside the cabin, a few passengers had started whispering to each other. Some glanced toward the silver metallic card lying on seat 2B, where Jessica Moore had tossed it like trash picked up in an airport hallway. Danielle didn't pick the card back up. She didn't need to rush to prove anything. She didn't need to shout, because she knew some people only start listening when they can no longer ignore what's right in front of them. And she also knew truth doesn't have to scream. It only needs to sit in silence long enough until someone has to face it. But beneath that calm exterior, her memory was quietly unlocking a room long sealed. A distant memory. Another flight. Alone. Danielle, then only 12 years old, sat by herself on a bench at O'Hare Airport, wearing the yellow sunflower dress her mother had chosen to make her look more grown up for her first flight. Her mother wasn't with her that day. Danielle was being sent to Chicago to visit her aunt, and like every other single mother, her mom believed that if her daughter dressed neatly, was polite, said thank you at the right moments, and smiled when needed, everything would be fine. But when Danielle handed her ticket to the flight attendant in the business class lane, the woman didn't look at the ticket. She looked her up and down. "Honey, are you sure you're in the right place?" Her voice wasn't loud, but soft enough to make the little girl feel like she'd made a mistake. And being wrong, in the eyes of a crowd, needs no logical proof, just skin color. They moved her to the back of the plane, near the tail. No reclining seat, no meal tray. It was a 3-hour flight, but she didn't dare ask for water. She didn't dare speak up. She didn't understand what she'd done wrong. All she knew was that the yellow dress her mom told her to keep neat for the trip suddenly felt cheap. Just like her. That memory never left. It only waited for its time to return. And now inside the first-class cabin of a Boeing 787, branded with a silver wing logo, that memory came rushing back with full force. She was no longer a 12-year-old in a flowered dress. She was a woman who had built an empire from the very moment she was shamed. Danielle took a long breath. "Tamara," she said into the phone still in her hand, "initiate level 2 documentation. Begin active timestamp on all personnel interactions. Link this cabin's feed to internal compliance." Tamara Green's voice came through from the other end. "All systems live. Documenting from gate D14. Do you want me to notify legal counsel?" Danielle looked directly at Jessica Moore, arms crossed, her gaze doubtful and defiant. "Not yet. Let them finish writing their own story." Captain William Steele stood by the cabin entrance, ear tuned to the internal radio but eyes fixed on her. "Listen, Miss Rhodes, I don't know who you think you are, but—" Danielle cut him off without raising her voice. "You do know who I am. You just don't believe it." Steele shook his head, lips curling into a thin, impatient smirk. "Look, We've got important passengers waiting. We can't afford delays over confusion with charity seating. The words came out like he was taking out the trash, not addressing the owner of the airline. Behind Steele, Miles Whitmore cleared his throat and spoke loudly enough for the front rows to hear. She doesn't belong here. That much is obvious. A few passengers looked over. No one defended her. No one agreed. But what was scarier was that no one objected either. That silence wasn't innocent. It was a familiar kind of complicity, quiet yet powerful. Jessica stepped forward, reaching out toward Danielle's laptop bag. "We'll have to check your belongings." Danielle didn't respond, but someone else did. Kendra Evans, the youngest flight attendant on the crew that day, stepped forward from the back, voice slightly shaky but firm. "Her ticket is valid. I checked it myself when she boarded." Jessica spun around. "You what?" "She was on the priority manifest," Kendra said, trying to steady her voice. "Seat 2A is hers." Captain Steele glared at Kendra as if she had spoken out of turn on national television. "This is not your call," he snapped. "You are not in charge of verification." But Danielle looked at Kendra, her gaze softening for the first time since the flight began. It wasn't a thank you. It was recognition. "I see you." Chris Daniels, the passenger recording from across the aisle, said loud enough to be heard, "This feels like targeted harassment." Allison Meyer beside him nodded. "Already uploading. Tagging the airline. This is disgusting." Jessica stepped back, her eyes darkening. "You're escalating things for no reason," she said, but her voice no longer carried the same conviction. Danielle then walked calmly to seat 2A and sat down. No words, no drama, just presence. And that was what truly unsettled them. When Jessica made a move toward the intercom to issue a false announcement about a disruptive passenger, Tamara's voice returned clearly. "3 passengers have already posted. Engagement is spiking. Hashtags forming. Legal team pinged. Shall I authorize live escalation report?" Danielle looked out the plane window. The light outside had softened, casting a misty sheen across the glass. She said quietly, "Not yet. Give them rope." Steele was losing patience. He grabbed his internal radio, signaling the ground crew supervisor. "Possible incident on board. Passenger in 2A refusing compliance." Danielle heard every word, every syllable, every intent, but she didn't move. One hand rested lightly on her bag. Inside it, a full internal audit report of racial discrimination complaints buried under Jessica Moore's tenure. Kendra stood her ground, saying nothing more. But her presence alone was enough to make the silent shadows shift. In the first 3 rows, a few passengers had started positioning their phones discreetly on their knees, angling their cameras. An elderly woman in seat 3B whispered, "She's the CEO? Why are they treating her like that?" Danielle spoke for the first time since sitting down. "Because they don't believe I earned it." Jessica turned back, eyes flaring. "What's that supposed to mean?" Danielle answered slowly. "You think the seat comes with the right clothes, the right skin tone, the right accent?" She looked Jessica straight in the eye. "What scares you is that it doesn't anymore." And for the first time, Jessica had no immediate response, because every excuse came too late once the truth had begun touching everyone in that cabin, like the first ripple of a coming storm. Danielle Rhodes sat upright in seat 2A, her eyes locked on the watch around her wrist. The minute hand had just ticked to exactly 4:10 p.m. On the other end of the secure line, Tamara Green, her assistant, was still connected, giving a constant stream of updates on online engagement, trending hashtags, passenger accounts posting videos, and the view count climbing by the second. Danielle spoke slowly, just loud enough for Tamara and others listening on the encrypted internal system to hear clearly. "Start the clock. They have 9 minutes to fix this. Or I will." Tamara confirmed. "Timer initiated. Documentation feed active. Legal team ready on standby." Danielle ended the call without hanging up, placing the phone face down on the armrest with the mic still live. Outside the cabin, the muffled sounds of ground crew voices bled in between bursts of hurried footsteps and the cabin door opening and closing repeatedly, like the air itself was tightening inch by inch. Jessica Moore stood near the galley, arms crossed, eyes dripping sarcasm. "You're threatening an entire crew with a timer?" She smirked. "Who do you think you are?" Danielle didn't turn to look. She simply replied, "Someone who doesn't let the same mistake happen twice." William Steele stepped forward, the seams on his pilot uniform tight at the shoulders, as though his own pride were pulling the fabric. "You've disrupted boarding. You've caused unrest. This isn't your playground, Miss Rhodes." Danielle's tone never changed. "This isn't a playground, Captain. This is my aircraft." A beat of silence, then the sharp sound of heels hitting the floor. A young man entered the cabin, Logan Price, a junior flight attendant Jessica had instructed to handle the difficult passenger. He said nothing. He simply marched over and yanked Danielle's laptop bag from under her arm without a word of warning. Danielle reacted quickly but kept her composure. "Excuse me?" Logan said nothing. He turned away, pushed past the curtain, and tossed the bag carelessly into the rear luggage compartment. "No loose bags in first class," he muttered, just loud enough for the front rows to hear. "We have standards to maintain." The jolt rippled through the cabin like static. Allison Meyer turned to Chris Daniels and whispered, "Did he just grab her bag without permission?" Chris only nodded, still filming. Danielle leaned slightly to peer past the curtain. "Bring my bag back," she said firmly. Logan didn't respond. Jessica chuckled nearby. "She's not a VIP. Doesn't matter what badge she flashes." Kendra, still standing nearby, looked straight at Jessica. "Her ticket is valid. She's cleared for 2A. Jessica snapped, "You're not in charge, Kendra. Stay in your lane." Miles Whitmore, the guest still lingering near the aisle, glanced at the unfolding chaos and muttered, just loud enough, "She's out of place, and now she's making a scene. Typical." A few people nodded slightly, not out of agreement, but because they didn't want trouble. And that nod, that silence, is exactly what systems like this rely on to survive. Microaggressions don't need shouting. They just need to be ignored. Danielle tightened her fingers slightly but did not rise. She remembered. This wasn't the first time she'd been publicly humiliated, nor the first time she was told to stay calm while being insulted. But this time, she was ready. This wasn't an accident. This was a lesson redesigned. And that lesson wasn't going to end with her walking away. Inside her earpiece, Tamara's voice returned. 3 minutes in. Viral metrics rising. Trending regionally. Legal counsel pinged us. They're watching. Danielle whispered, "Let them watch." Chris Daniels leaned to the side and said, "This is blowing up. Over 50,000 views in the last 2 minutes. Allison added, "And we're not even airborne." Danielle stood, walked directly to the curtain, and said clearly, "Logan, I asked you to return my property." Logan turned back, his eyes avoiding hers, but Jessica barked behind him, "Don't respond." "She's being combative." Kendra shook her head, stepping beside Danielle for the first time as an ally. "She's not. You are." A sigh echoed from the rear rows. Then a man stood up and spoke clearly. "Why is this even happening? She hasn't done anything." William Steele cut in. "Sir, we're handling a seating irregularity. Please remain seated." Danielle didn't flinch. She spoke louder. "This is not about a seat. This is about the assumptions you made the moment I walked through that door." Then she turned to the entire cabin. "Let me ask you all something. What would you do if this happened to your mother, your daughter, your friend?" A beat of silence, then a few heads nodded. For the first time, the balance in the cabin had shifted. Jessica rushed toward the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're currently resolving a situation involving a passenger whose documentation—" Kendra snatched the mic from her hand. "Stop lying." She turned to everyone. "She's the CEO of this airline. I saw her credentials. I verified her ticket. You're being lied to." William Steele's face flushed with rage. "You're out of line, Ms. Evans." But Kendra didn't back down. "No, Captain. I'm finally in line. With the truth." Allison stood up, holding her phone high. "They're losing this fight, Chris." Chris nodded silently. Danielle turned to face Steele, Jessica, Logan. "You have 5 minutes left." Miles Whitmore, who had been silent since the beginning, stepped forward, staring at Danielle. "You think power comes from a title on a card?" Danielle replied without blinking. "No. It comes from standing in the fire and not moving." Miles scoffed, then stepped back, defeated. Danielle checked the time. 4 minutes left. She didn't speak. She didn't have to threaten, didn't have to yell. The truth was already shaking everything false. And just then, Tamara's voice came through the earpiece. Corporate board just tuned in. External media requests incoming. What's your move? Danielle raised her head and spoke clearly. We're not escalating yet. Let them expose themselves. And she turned back, sat down in seat 2A, as if no one had ever laid a hand on her, as if she was the only one still calm amid the chaos. And the truth was, she was the only one with the right to be. In that moment, the airplane cabin was no longer just a place where passengers waited for takeoff. It had become a stage. Every action, every word, every glance exchanged between staff and passengers played out as if broadcast on a giant screen. Not just for those inside the cabin, but for the thousands outside, watching in real time through videos being uploaded by the second. And yet, at the center of the storm, Danielle Rhodes remained completely still. Everyone was waiting for her to react, but she was only waiting for the right moment. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew exactly what was about to happen. And more importantly, she knew they weren't ready. Jessica Moore, still unwilling to concede, tried to reclaim control by stepping briskly toward Danielle and issuing a sharp command. You need to vacate this seat until this is sorted. Danielle didn't look at her. She simply exhaled slowly, then tilted her head slightly toward Logan Price, the junior flight attendant still standing near the luggage compartment where her laptop bag had been stashed. Logan, she said, you still have one chance to do the right thing. Give me back my bag. Logan hesitated, glancing at Jessica as if waiting for permission, but Jessica turned away, unwilling to be directly implicated. And in that instant, something flickered in Logan's eyes. Not confidence, not defiance, but fear. The kind that comes with realizing you've been left alone. Chris Daniels, the nearby passenger, spoke up. She asked nicely. The decent thing is to give it back. Allison Meyer, still filming, added, this whole thing is spiraling because you all refuse to treat her like a person? Logan wavered but didn't move. Danielle gave a small nod as if to say, if he didn't act now, whatever came next, he'd carry it for the rest of his life. 3 minutes left, she said. Then unexpectedly, Jessica stepped forward, leaned in close to Danielle, and whispered, you think your badge makes you untouchable? Danielle replied immediately, no, but your actions make you replaceable. Jessica sneered and turned away. But only seconds later, Tamara's voice came through Danielle's earpiece. We've just flagged a match on Jessica Moore's name. Danielle, there's a prior complaint, same pattern, passenger of color, reassigned to economy. Scanned ticket was valid. Danielle closed her eyes for a single beat, not to retreat, but to contain the rage that was brushing up against its limit. She thought to herself, so it's true. Danielle stood, and this time no one stopped her. She walked calmly toward Jessica. There was another case, wasn't there? Jessica didn't answer. Danielle continued. You rerouted someone else. Black woman, valid ticket. You told her the system glitched. It didn't. Jessica turned back toward her. You have no idea what pressures we're under. Danielle replied, you don't get to weaponize inconvenience. You don't get to pretend bias is protocol. A few passengers began to rise from their seats. Not loudly, not in protest. They simply stood to show that they were watching. A woman in her 50s, warm presence, spoke up from row 3. This feels like déjà vu. I've seen this happen before, just not to someone with power. Danielle turned to her, gave a slight nod. Then she turned once more to Logan, now visibly unraveling. I'm not here to destroy anyone, she said, but I won't let this cycle continue either. Logan finally lowered his head, walked to the luggage compartment, retrieved the laptop bag, and handed it to Danielle with both hands. That moment, though small, was the boundary. Danielle took the bag without a word of thanks, not out of ingratitude, but because true decency should not arrive only after fear and pressure. She returned to her seat, placed the bag down, and unzipped it. From inside, she pulled out a file folder with a clear title, Vista Blue, Internal Ethics Brief, Suppressed Complaints. Allison raised her camera higher. Chris whispered, "That's real?" Danielle didn't answer. She simply opened the first page, revealing the list of named personnel. And in the middle, Jessica Moore. Kendra stood tall now, no longer looking at Danielle as a colleague, but as a model. "I saw that complaint come in," Kendra said. "She told me not to escalate it." Danielle turned to her. "You remember the passenger?" Kendra nodded. "I do. She had a daughter. She cried when they moved her. Said it wasn't the first time." Danielle exhaled. "And now it will be the last." The cabin announcement chimed. "We're preparing to close doors for departure. Final boarding call for gate D14. But no one cared about takeoff anymore. Not because they didn't want to leave, but because they knew. They were witnessing a flight no one would ever be allowed to forget. Danielle picked up her phone, tapped the screen and said, "Tamara, prepare formal HR directive, pending my confirmation." Then she turned toward Jessica, William, and Logan. "You have 2 minutes left." Danielle Rhodes quietly unlocked her phone as her laptop bag rested securely beside her. The screen lit up, already open to the high-level internal coordination interface, a system accessible to only 3 individuals across all of Vista Blue Airlines. The other 2 were back at headquarters in Denver. She entered a 14-character verification code and spoke clearly into the microphone. "Tamara, activate Protocol Astra. Link cabin documentation. Begin audio plus visual timestamp. This is now official." Tamara's voice returned on the other end. "Confirmed. Internal log linked. Timestamp locked. Back-end compliance team pinged. Your discretion is now full authority." Danielle set the phone down. No raised voice. No need. From this moment forward, she didn't need to reclaim her authority because she was now executing it. William Steele, having overheard the words internal log, began to grow uneasy but tried to maintain a firm front. "This is outrageous. You think you can just come on board and start firing orders?" Danielle turned to him, her gaze free of anger, but sharp enough to cut like an audit report prepared months in advance. "Number, I don't think. I know." Jessica Moore stood silent near the galley door, her posture frozen. Kendra Evans, still nearby, stepped forward once again, this time not to defend, but to stand beside Danielle. It was a choice. No speech needed, just presence. "Allison," Danielle turned to the passenger who had been filming since the beginning. "Can you confirm your footage has not been interrupted?" Allison nodded. "I have 2 files saved and 1 streaming. Do you want me to stop?" Danielle shook her head. "Number, but I do want you to stay safe." Chris Daniels beside her looked surprised but said nothing. He was beginning to understand. This woman hadn't come to escalate a problem. She had come to end a cycle. Danielle returned to seat 2A, not to sit but to unzip her laptop bag. She pulled out a folder, flipped through a few pages, and placed a document on the folding tray table. Bold lettering at the top read, "Notice of Preliminary Disciplinary Action. Moore, Steele, Price. 3 names. 1 action." She picked it up and read aloud, not loudly but with clarity in every word. "This document serves as preliminary notice of personnel evaluation under Vista Blue Airlines Equity and Conduct Mandate." William Steele took a step forward, voice tight. "You can't do this. This isn't your courtroom." Danielle looked him in the eye. "No, Captain. This is your performance review." A passenger in the 4th row let out a soft laugh. No one tried to stop it. On the contrary, several people started pulling out their phones, not out of curiosity, but because they now felt safer recording the truth. Jessica stepped back. Logan Price, who had returned Danielle's bag, began sweating. He looked to William as if for help, but William was already wrestling with his own unraveling sense of control. They had never imagined they would face consequences, because they had never imagined the other person had power. "Let's make something clear," Danielle continued, her voice steady and decisive. "This is not about a mistake. It's about a pattern, one that's been protected, ignored, and buried. Not anymore." Kendra turned to Jessica. "I remember that flight last fall. The mother with 2 kids. She cried when you sent her back to coach." Jessica stumbled. "That was a manifest mismatch." Danielle interrupted. "No, it wasn't. We have the scan logs." A long silence followed. Those who once tuned out were now feeling their hearts beat faster. Not from fear, but from hope. Chris Daniels whispered to Allison, "This isn't just about her. It's about all the people who were told they were too much or not enough." Allison replied under her breath, "She's not trying to be a hero. She's trying to stop a cycle." Danielle heard it, but didn't respond. She was opening the screen on her tablet, pulling up a real-time dashboard from the complaint department. The display showed over 300 feedback reports marked as pending review, with nearly 60% coming from passengers of color or minority backgrounds. Tamara messaged, "Cross-indexing now. Initial match, 22 cases tied to Jessica Moore. Shall I proceed with legal draft?" Danielle responded, "Wait, let her speak first." She turned to Jessica. "You have one opportunity to own your role in this. It won't erase the past, but it might help save your future." Jessica bit her lip. For the first time, her gaze fell to the floor. "I didn't think they would ever fight back," she murmured. Danielle exhaled. "And that's the problem. You bet on silence." William Steele jumped in. "She didn't act alone. If you're going to investigate, you need to look at operations too." Danielle wasn't surprised. She had already anticipated the domino effect of finger-pointing. She simply replied, "We will." Kendra spoke up again, this time with a different tone entirely. "And you can add me to the witness list. I was told to look away. I won't anymore." A few scattered claps echoed, but this time they weren't celebratory. They were for someone who stood up and wasn't pulled back down. Danielle looked at her watch. 1 minute remaining. She picked up the phone and said, "Tamara, prep the directive." Then she turned to the cabin. "You all came on this flight expecting a destination, but you're witnessing something more important. A shift, not in altitude, but in accountability." No one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. The faces that turned toward her no longer looked curious. They looked quietly aligned. "Allison, upload the segment where Jessica admits prior action. Tag it, #pattern, not mistake." Allison nodded. "Already posted." Chris added, "Trending in 3 states." Danielle stood once more. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to point. But no one in that cabin doubted who was actually flying this plane. And in less than 60 seconds, she would prove that a woman doesn't have to raise her voice to make an entire system fall silent and listen. 4:17 p.m. The watch on Danielle Rhodes's wrist marked the 8th minute of the 9-minute warning she had given the entire cabin. But by now, no one was thinking about time. They were just waiting to see what would fall next. And incredibly, it didn't come from an outburst or a dramatic gesture. It came from a word barely above a whisper, but strong enough to crack an entire wall of denial. "Enough." One word. Spoken by the voice of Kendra Evans, the young flight attendant who had stood beside Danielle throughout the flight. This time she didn't glance around for backup. She simply said, "Enough of this." William Steele turned, ready to cut her off, but she continued before he could speak. "I watched us humiliate a woman who had every right to be here. And not just today. I've seen it before. We've all seen it." The air seemed to be sucked from the cabin. Jessica Moore stepped back half a foot, her face pale. Logan Price turned away, avoiding eye contact with anyone. But Danielle didn't. She looked straight at Kendra, saying nothing, but her gaze was a silent affirmation, recognition without applause. Chris Daniels whispered, "She's not just witnessing. She's choosing." Allison Meyer nodded, still filming. "And now others might too." Danielle took a step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, but steady, like the floor of the aircraft had turned into the floor of a courtroom. "Kendra," she said, "do you have anything else to add for the record?" Kendra nodded, this time without trembling. "Yes. I was told 2 months ago to de-escalate a complaint from a black family who was misseated despite having confirmation. Jessica told me not to file the full report, just mark it as resolved in cabin. But it wasn't resolved. They cried." A shocked "oh my God" came from a passenger. Someone in seat 1D spoke loudly. "Why didn't you say anything then?" Kendra turned, her voice tight but firm. "Because I was scared. Because I was new. Because I thought if I just kept my head down, I could survive." Danielle followed up. "And now, Kendra looked at her. Now I'd rather lose this job than lose myself. The first clap came from the middle rows. No chants, no slogans. Just one person starting, then another, then three, then 10. William Steele turned, visibly angry. This is turning into a protest. This is not allowed. Danielle replied calmly, It's not a protest, Captain. It's a correction. He stepped forward. You're using emotion to manipulate the crew and passengers. Danielle held her ground, eyes locked. No, I'm using truth, and you're the one who made it necessary. Jessica moved toward the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, please be advised that we are experiencing a delay due to unauthorized disruption. Kendra stepped up and yanked the mic from her hand. Stop! Lying! Jessica shouted. You're out of line! Danielle interjected immediately. No! She's finally in line, with integrity. William Steele came close to Danielle, voice low and heavy as iron. You're causing chaos. You're holding up a flight full of people. Danielle answered without hesitation. No. I'm holding up a lie that's been flying for far too long. Behind them, Logan Price slowly backed away toward the galley, removing himself from view. But someone stepped forward from the back. A thin, middle-aged woman, her hands slightly trembling, but her gaze crystal clear. I've flown this airline for 15 years, she said, and I've never said anything before. But I saw how you looked at her when she boarded. I saw how you spoke to her, and I saw how she never raised her voice once. That's not disruption. That's dignity. The entire cabin seemed frozen. No one was seated anymore. Some passengers stood along the aisle. Others were live streaming. But there was no chaos, no screaming. Only one thing filled the space now, the refusal to back down. Danielle looked toward the cockpit door. Captain Steele, I've documented your language, your refusal to acknowledge credentials, and your failure to de-escalate a bias-based situation. He said coldly, You don't scare me, Miss Rhodes. Danielle gave a faint smile for the first time all day. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just showing you that I'm not afraid anymore. Tamara's voice came through the earpiece. Confirmation package complete. Documentation of all key personnel uploaded. Executive override available. Do you wish to proceed? Danielle answered, Not yet. We're not done showing who they really are. Chris Daniels asked, She could have walked off. Why stay through all this? Allison Meyer replied softly, Because someone needed to be the last one who let it slide. That sentence spread through the air like a signal. And this time, the one who stood up was a white man, around 60, from seat 1C. I'm sorry, he said, turning to Danielle. I didn't say anything earlier, but I see you. I see what you're doing, and I support it. Danielle nodded gently. Then don't say sorry. Say something when it counts. He nodded. Next time I will. Danielle replied, No. This is the time. Tamara messaged again. 1 minute left on your original window. Danielle turned to Jessica. You have 60 seconds to explain why I shouldn't proceed with termination. Jessica froze, her mouth moving, but no words coming out. Kendra turned to Danielle. Don't wait for them. They never waited for us. Danielle exhaled slowly, then nodded. She picked up her phone and pressed the confirmation button. And in that final minute of the 9 she had granted, Danielle Rhodes officially crossed the line between outrage and action. No more backing down. No more hoping they'd fix it themselves. From now on, she would be the one doing the fixing. Danielle Rhodes stood tall, her right hand holding the phone with its screen lit up in red. Executive override. Confirmation locked. She hadn't pressed the button yet, but everyone in the cabin could feel it. Real power had shifted. And when that power comes from someone once dismissed, touched without consent, and denied, she doesn't have to scream to make the entire system tremble. William Steele hadn't backed down. On the contrary, he stepped forward, trying to grasp onto the crumbling authority slipping through his fingers like dry sand. Ma'am, I am the pilot in command of this aircraft. If you interfere with crew operations, I am authorized to request removal, immediately. Danielle didn't blink. Then do it. Make the call. But know this, every second is being documented, and what you call removal, others might call assault. Steele looked around and noticed 3 separate phones recording. Allison Meyer was still filming from mid-cabin. Another passenger was live streaming on TikTok. A third had mounted their phone to the armrest, camera pointed straight at the cockpit. He spun around, grabbed the cabin radio, pressed the button. Security. This is Captain Steele. I have a disruptive passenger in 2A. Request immediate removal. That sentence landed like an axe into the silence. A breath split in half across the cabin. Some passengers whispered, "No way!" Chris Daniels jumped to his feet, barely registering what had just been said before Logan Price, the same man who once yanked Danielle's laptop bag, stepped toward her. "I've been ordered to escort you off the aircraft," he said, his voice taut like a violin string. Danielle hadn't yet reacted when he reached out and grabbed her shoulder, shoving hard. She stumbled, thrown off balance, bumping into the armrest in the aisle. A sharp "Whoa!" erupted from all sides. Someone shouted, "Don't touch her!" A woman in seat 3A stood abruptly, placing herself between Logan and Danielle. "You're not laying another finger on her," she said, voice trembling but firm. Another passenger, a young man in a hoodie, stood up next. Then another. Then three. Then five. Within seconds, the aircraft aisle had become a barricade, not of slogans, but of human beings, shoulder to shoulder, eyes like steel. Danielle straightened up. She hadn't stepped back, but this time she wasn't standing alone. Jamal Carter, the security officer summoned from the boarding gate, appeared at the front of the cabin. His face was stoic, professional, but his eyes were quietly observant. William Steele pointed directly at Danielle. "That's her." Passenger 2A refusing to comply. But Jamal didn't move forward immediately. He looked at Danielle, then at Kendra, then at Jessica, and finally at Logan. He asked calmly, "Has there been physical contact?" Chris Daniels stepped forward. "Yes." He shoved her. We all saw it. Allison turned her camera toward Logan. "It's all on video." Every second Jamal nodded and stepped forward, but not toward Danielle, toward Logan. Jessica panicked. He was following orders. Jamal looked up. "That's not how accountability works." William Steele, still clutching the cabin radio, was losing his composure. "This is absurd. We are losing control of the cabin." Danielle responded instantly. "No, Captain. You're losing control of the narrative. The cabin is finally breathing." Jessica moved toward Jamal. "You don't understand. She's provoking passengers. She's undermining crew authority." Kendra cut in, her voice like a blade. "She's not provoking anyone. She's provoking the truth." Logan stepped back, pale as a sheet. Jamal stood in the aisle, facing the human wall of passengers. "I need you all to step aside if you're not involved." The woman from 3A looked him straight in the eye. "We are involved. We saw what happened. We're not moving." A man in a white button-down added, "If this is how you treat your own boss, what chance do the rest of us have?" Danielle didn't touch her phone again. She simply stepped forward. One step, and each person in that wall parted gently, making way for her as if opening the floor for a traveling courtroom. But no one left their spot. They didn't need instructions. They only needed someone brave enough to go first. William Steele shouted, "You're obstructing crew operations. That's a federal offense." Chris Daniels raised his phone even higher. "So is assaulting a passenger on camera." Jessica screamed, "You're all violating policy." Kendra replied sharply, "We're defending a person. That's not policy. That's human." Danielle stood before the human wall, her eyes no longer cold, her voice steady and firm. "This isn't just about bias. It's about how many people had to be silent so you could feel right." She turned to Jamal. "I am authorizing immediate disciplinary review, effective now." Jamal asked, "Do you have corporate clearance?" Danielle held up her phone and pressed a button. The screen lit up. Executive termination mode. Active. Jamal nodded. "Understood." A single click, like a digital execution order. Jessica Moore, William Steele, Logan Price, each one reduced to a ghost in the very cabin they once controlled. And that wall of people, it didn't crack. It simply exhaled. Jamal Carter, the airport security officer, stood firmly in the aisle of the first-class cabin, his earpiece still connected to the internal command center, but his eyes never left Danielle Rhodes. In her hand, The phone screen glowed with the unmistakable red banner. Executive termination. Confirmation locked. She hadn't even pressed anything further, and yet in less than 5 minutes, the entire internal oversight system of Vista Blue Airlines was being funneled back into this very aircraft. No one left their seat. No one dared pretend they hadn't heard anymore. Tamara Green, her executive assistant, was still on the line, her voice calm, but edged with a precise urgency. Danielle, I've run the archive retrieval on all complaints tagged for bias, disruption, or escalation override, cross-referenced with crew ID numbers tied to Jessica Moore, William Steele, and Logan Price. Do you want the summary or the full download? Danielle stared ahead, her eyes cutting through the passengers watching her. Give me both, Tamara replied. Total of 76 unique complaints flagged in the last 18 months. Of those, 49 were filed by passengers identifying as people of color. 26 never reached final review. 19 were marked resolved at gate without passenger confirmation. 11 involved children. Danielle inhaled, slow and deep. Each number hit not the flesh, but the moral spine of the very airline she founded. Tamara continued. Jessica Moore is mentioned in 23 of them. William Steele in 12th, Logan Price in 7th. There's overlap. And one more thing. Danielle nodded slightly. Go on. Tamara lowered her voice. There's an internal group message thread, unofficial, crew level, labeled Clean Skies. Danielle knew instantly the name wasn't innocent. What was shared there? Tamara answered. Language about handling problematic passengers. Code phrases for rerouting without documentation. Advice on tone to use so complaints sound subjective. There's one message from Jessica that reads, remember, if it doesn't escalate, it disappears. Danielle closed her eyes for just a second. In that breath of stillness, everything she had once suspected, once heard whispered, once felt as a vague wrong, now had evidence. It wasn't just an incident, it was a system. Chris Daniels, sitting nearby, noticed her silence. You okay? He asked. Danielle opened her eyes and looked at him. No, but I'm clear. Then she picked up the phone again. Tamara, begin full recall. Elevate Clean Skies thread to executive review. Freeze all complaint archives going back 5 years. Tamara replied, understood. Forwarding to legal counsel and compliance. Initiating system-wide audit hold. Allison Meyer, who had been filming since the start, glanced at Chris and said, she's not just firing people. She's about to burn the blueprint. Chris replied, good, because someone wrote that blueprint thinking nobody would read it. Jessica Moore, now silent, backed toward the galley door, as if hoping eyes would shift away from her, but Danielle stared directly at her. How long have you been deleting reports? Jessica looked up, no longer smug, only terrified. I didn't delete, I just delayed, Danielle asked. Under whose direction? Jessica stammered. We were told not to create escalation patterns, not to make the airline look unstable. Danielle's voice sharpened. Told? By who? Jessica whispered. Manager. Old base ops. Atlanta hub. Before you took full control. Tamara cut in again. That would be Brian Whitlow. Retired last year, 24-year veteran. Records show he led quarterly crew briefings on efficiency handling. No recording policy in place. Nothing official. Danielle lifted her chin. How many passengers paid for that silence? No one answered. Because everyone knew the number wasn't in any database. It lived in the memories of every person who'd ever been asked, are you sure you belong here? Kendra stepped forward. I remember Brian. He used to say, don't make a ripple over one row. Danielle murmured, but now they're drowning in the wave. Danielle tapped her screen again, pulling up a real-time complaint dashboard. Reports started flooding in at an alarming rate. Line after line in red, notes marked resolved, without customer confirmation. One file read, passenger was reassigned due to flight miscommunication. Notes suggest escalation not necessary. At the bottom, under crew involved, Jessica Moore, William Steele. Danielle raised her voice, for the first time that day. This is what happens when we let policy replace humanity, when we think efficiency justifies erasure. A woman in the cabin burst into tears. A man murmured, "This isn't just about a seat." Jamal Carter stepped forward solemn. "Ms. Rhodes, I've reviewed your authority. As per federal protocol, you may proceed with full escalation, including termination and internal investigation order." Danielle nodded. "Then I do. Effective now, Vista Blue Airlines is launching the Clean Skies Review. All internal complaints suppressed in the last 5 years will be reopened, reevaluated, and audited for bias." Tamara returned. "System confirmation. Reopening 311 complaints. Data flagged. Legal team notified. We are now in historical corrective mode." Danielle looked across the cabin. A young boy in row 4, brown-skinned, holding a printed boarding pass, stared at her with eyes she recognized, the same eyes she had once carried at 12 years old. She spoke softly. "This isn't just about fixing a mistake. It's about ending a practice. It's about making sure the next kid with the wrong clothes or the wrong last name doesn't have to earn their place through silence." No one clapped, but everyone looked at each other, and in that shared silence, they understood. Something had changed, not in the media, but in the marrow. Danielle Rhodes placed her tablet on the tray table of seat 2A, the screen still displaying the internal complaint dashboard, marked with time-stamped red entries like open wounds left unstitched. She looked around the cabin, her gaze moving slowly across every face. Those who had witnessed, those who had turned away, those who had stayed silent, or those who had bravely stood up. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't rushed, but rang out as clearly as a judge's gavel in court. "I've seen enough, and now so have you." Jamal Carter, the security officer standing beside her, nodded. "Ms. Rhodes, you may proceed." Danielle didn't look at him. She looked directly at the 3 individuals standing near the galley door. Jessica Moore, her eyes wide and frozen. William Steele, jaw clenched. Logan Price, head bowed, shoulders curled like a man stripped of his last layer of armor. Danielle took one step forward, not to approach, but to melt the frozen air. She stopped in the aisle, still holding the phone streaming live into the emergency boardroom at Vista Blue headquarters in Denver. "I'm Danielle Rhodes, Chief Executive Officer of Vista Blue Global Holdings, and I declare, with full authority, that the following individuals," she paused for one deliberate beat, her eyes never leaving them, "are hereby terminated from employment, effective immediately." A few murmurs rose but were swallowed by the thick silence stretching like the moment before a storm breaks. Captain William Steele, for abuse of authority, intentional misidentification of a verified passenger, and active participation in the suppression of bias-related complaints. Terminated effective now. William opened his mouth, but no sound came. Danielle continued without pause. Lead flight attendant Jessica Moore, for deliberate misinformation, racial targeting, and systematic suppression of misconduct reports over a period of at least 18 months. Terminated effective now. Jessica cried out, "You can't!" But Danielle cut her off, her voice as final as a slammed door. "I already did. Flight attendant Logan Price, for unlawful physical contact with a verified passenger, failure to comply with basic de-escalation protocol, and involvement in off-record crew misconduct networks. Terminated effective now." Logan turned away, his eyes glazed like rain-streaked glass. No one spoke. No one defended. Silence was no longer complicity. It was agreement. Tamara's voice came through the earpiece. "Corporate has just received your formal submission. Documentation signed, archived, and relayed to legal. HR files are now locked. Access terminated." Jamal nodded to confirm. "All 3 are now non-crew. I'll escort them as per protocol." Danielle nodded back. "Escort them gently." "We're not them." Jessica burst into tears, clutching her uniform like the fabric might preserve what her words had already destroyed. "Please, I didn't think it would go this far." Danielle stepped closer, her eyes not cold, but firm. "That's the problem. You thought no one ever would." William turned to Jamal. "You're going to let her humiliate us like this?" Jamal replied calmly, "No. You did that yourselves." Kendra Evans, who had witnessed the entire confrontation, stepped forward to stand beside Danielle. "I want to file an addendum," she said. Danielle asked. On what grounds? Kendra looked at Jessica. Jessica told me last month to ignore a passenger's complaint about being called aggressive for asking for hot water. The complaint disappeared from our system. Danielle nodded. Noted. Tamara? Tamara answered. Recovered. Already matched. It's logged. A passenger from the middle rows spoke up. What about the rest? The ones not on this flight? Danielle turned toward her, voice steady. We're not done. Every complaint marked resolved without passenger confirmation will be reopened. Every name involved will be investigated. This isn't retribution. This is restoration. A man in his 50s stood up and said loudly, I watched all of this unfold. I've flown Vista Blue for years. This is the first time I've seen accountability in the air. A woman whispered, She didn't even raise her voice. Chris Daniels spoke just loudly enough for all to hear. She didn't need to. Jessica, William, and Logan were escorted out of the cabin in silence. No insults, no photos. But the eyes of the passengers, their looks not of contempt but clarity, stained the uniforms those three still wore like ink that wouldn't wash out. When they disappeared through the rear door of the cabin, Danielle turned back to seat 2A. She didn't sit. She looked down at the open laptop bag, where the list of crew members flagged as never formally investigated continued to scroll. There were many, far too many. Tamara came through again. Would you like to continue the review? Danielle answered, Yes, but not from here. We'll build something more permanent. Kendra asked, Like what? Danielle looked her in the eye. An internal ethics division, fully independent, with teeth. Allison Meyer from the front row paused her camera for just 1 second to say, Make sure it has a microphone too. Danielle smiled slightly. Oh, it will, and it won't turn off. Jamal asked, Do you still want to fly today? Danielle looked around the cabin. Every passenger looked back. No one left their seat. No one asked for compensation. No one shouted in protest. They were just waiting for something right to finally begin. Danielle nodded. Yes, but not with ghosts in the crew. A few light chuckles broke the tension. Quiet, but real. Chris Daniels whispered to Allison. Her voice was the quietest, but it just buried 3 careers. Allison replied, No. The truth did. She just opened the ground. First class sat in silence after the public terminations. The airplane door remained open. No one demanded takeoff. No one urged departure. Every passenger still held their phones, but no longer out of curiosity, because they were now part of something far greater. Danielle Rhodes stood in the aisle like a living embodiment of company law, not reading from policy, but representing a principle. Reputation can't protect anyone when ethics are gone. And just then, from the galley, someone stepped forward, slowly, his face marked with hesitation and shame. It was Mark Litton, a veteran flight attendant who had gone almost unnoticed throughout the flight, mostly stationed in the back. He hadn't been among the 3 dismissed, but he hadn't stood up. He hadn't spoken out, until now. Mark walked up beside Danielle, lifted his head, and spoke with a gravelly voice. There's something I need to say, on the record. Danielle didn't respond. She simply turned to face him, her gaze steady, expectant. Mark drew in a deep breath, like a man stepping into cold water he could no longer avoid. I was in the meetings, with Brian Whitlow, the ones Jessica mentioned. Allison raised her camera again. Chris Daniels glanced at Mark, eyes narrowed with suspicion. But Mark didn't look at anyone but Danielle. He taught us phrases, not policies, ways to minimize escalation, ways to redirect complaints without acknowledging bias. He said, avoid keywords like race, color, or origin. Say disruptive. Say combative. Say unclear documentation. Danielle didn't flinch. Mark continued. We practiced it with scripts. We used passenger profiles. We role-played how to talk around race, not address it, avoid it. A woman in the cabin whispered, Oh my God. Mark pressed on. I used it. I filed reports that said misunderstanding when I knew it wasn't. I marked things resolved at gate when I never followed up. He stepped back slightly. I'm not proud. I'm not innocent. But I want to stop now. Today. Danielle asked, why now? Mark swallowed hard. Because you didn't raise your voice, and we still heard you. Danielle nodded. No smile. No scowl. Just a nod, like acknowledging that the truth had finally returned. Tamara Green's voice came through the earpiece. We've matched Mark Litton's crew ID to 11 suppressed complaints over 3 years. Would you like to flag for review? Danielle paused for a single beat. Yes, but flag it as cooperative witness under declaration. Mark looked up, surprised. Danielle added, if you want to be part of cleaning this up, then you start by telling everything. In writing. Under oath. We don't need martyrs. We need messengers. Mark nodded. I'll do it. A passenger whispered, that's what accountability looks like. Allison turned to her camera. And what redemption sounds like. Danielle stepped back, facing the entire cabin. For years, complaints were buried under operational lingo, under the excuse of confusion, under metrics. But from today, Vista Blue will acknowledge every single complaint, even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones. Tamara continued, executive authority validated. Formal announcement ready for system-wide cascade. Would you like to proceed with reform rollout? Danielle replied clearly. Proceed. She turned to the passengers. No microphone needed. Today, we begin the Equity Rebuild Initiative. All staff will be retrained. All reports will be human-reviewed. No automated rejections. We'll establish a protected reporting channel for employees, and passengers will receive full access to complaint tracking. An older man nodded. You're not just fixing a flight. You're fixing an industry. Danielle looked at him. Her tone softened for the first time. That's the hope. Kendra stepped forward and handed Danielle a sheet of paper. It's my formal witness statement and my commitment to lead this cabin with the same standards you just set. Danielle took it, folded it, and tucked it into her pocket. You'll have more than this cabin. You'll help rewrite the onboarding protocols. You stood up when it mattered. Allison whispered to Chris, this flight didn't just delay a takeoff. It just took off something else entirely. Jamal Carter stood beside Danielle and asked, what about the passengers? Danielle turned to face them all. You've all just witnessed a turning point. If anyone here experienced harm today, verbal, emotional, or psychological, you'll receive a full refund and a formal apology. But more than that, you now have a line straight to me. Not through bots, not through walls, through policy that listens. Chris said, we're staying on this airline. Allison nodded. Because she didn't walk away. She walked in. Danielle smiled, just faintly, the kind of smile from someone who had carried a mountain and still had strength left for the road ahead. Mark stood nearby, silent, but for the first time, he saw passengers' eyes that weren't full of doubt. No one forgot he had once stayed quiet, but everyone saw he didn't choose to stay that way. Danielle said softly for him alone, it's not how long you were silent. It's what you say when you finally speak. When Flight VB2120 finally took off from Boston, almost 2 hours delayed due to a dramatic confrontation, not a single passenger complained. There were no grumbles from economy class, not one frown about missing phone chargers in the seats. The cabin was silent, not out of exhaustion, but because they were witnessing something that had never happened before in American skies. A flight powered not by engines, but by truth. Danielle Rhodes didn't sit in the center aisle like most CEOs would. She chose seat 2A, by the window, quiet and detached. Not to avoid anyone, but to observe. As the plane slowly ascended, the late afternoon sky cast shadows across the glass. Danielle hadn't opened her tablet. She didn't need to. The most important data wasn't in spreadsheets. It had just appeared in the eyes of the dozens of passengers who had witnessed justice emerge. Without media, without microphones. Kendra, the newly appointed cabin chief replacing Jessica Moore, quietly approached, holding a cup of hot tea. We usually offer champagne in first class, she said softly, but I figured you needed clarity, not celebration. Danielle nodded and took the tea, her lips barely curving. Clarity is the new luxury. From her seat, Danielle looked around the cabin as if reading a living document. An older man adjusted his seatbelt, A white grandmother held her granddaughter's hand like she feared time would slip away too fast. A young man quietly typed on his phone. I was there. I saw justice. Every face was a new training manual waiting to be rewritten. Every glance, a report ready to be updated. Just then, a girl about 12 years old slowly stepped up from a row behind. She didn't walk fast, as if afraid to disturb. In her hands was a hardcover notebook with worn corners. Miss Rhodes? Danielle turned. Yes? The girl held out the notebook, her voice shy and unsure. Can I get your autograph? My mom says you're not just a boss, you're a builder. Danielle looked at the mother behind her, a black woman, dressed simply, her eyes glistening as if holding on to an unspoken memory. Danielle took the notebook and wrote more than a signature. If your voice trembles, whisper truth anyway. The girl read the words, then asked, Is that your slogan? Danielle looked directly at her. It's a promise I made when I was your age. Danielle leaned back in her seat, but her mind traveled 18 years into the past, to a memory long asleep but never erased. She was 10 years old when she first flew to New York with her mother to attend her great-grandmother's funeral. The airport wasn't busy that day, but the look on the check-in clerk's face when he saw her mother was carved into her memory like stone. Are you sure you bought this ticket? The clerk had asked, not loudly, but with unmistakable doubt. Her mother wore a black dress, clutched a handbag, and handed over the paperwork. But somehow the quiet dignity of how she carried herself made people suspicious. Danielle didn't fully understand then, but she saw her mother pause. She saw how her mother chose not to argue, chose silence. They were allowed through after a thorough check, but what lingered wasn't the documents. It was the wrinkle left in their dignity. That night in the motel room, her mother held her close and said, You don't have to scream to be heard, but if one day you can speak, then speak for those who can't. That sentence stayed with her through all the years ahead, through exams, through rejected internship applications from firms who said, Black girls don't really fit aviation marketing, through presentations where she had to prove twice as much just to be seen as average. When Danielle was finally accepted into Vista Blue as a training assistant, she didn't say much, but she watched. When she became HR director, senior managers still got her name wrong. When she became VP, outsiders assumed she was selected to diversify the team. But no one asked how many protocols she had rebuilt, how many failed contracts she had salvaged from a system that didn't know how to listen. Today, for the first time, she no longer wanted to repair quietly. Danielle stood up, walked to the front of the cabin, and pressed the intercom. Her voice rang out, not trembling, not denying the truth, but needing no defense. This is your CEO speaking, she began. But today, I'm not here to speak as a leader. I'm here as someone who's been mistaken, misjudged, and misnamed more times than I can count. And yet I chose not to shout. Not because I was weak, but because I was waiting. Waiting for a moment when the system itself would be quiet enough to finally listen. She paused. The air inside the cabin froze. We fly over 60 million passengers each year, but how many of them feel truly seen? How many of our staff know they're more than a name tag? This isn't about firing a crew. It's about rewriting the script we all were told to follow without question. Danielle continued. That's why today we're launching the Clear Skies Code, built not by compliance officers, but by survivors of silence. For the next 3 months, every regional office will open listening sessions, not to monitor, but to understand. We will publish redacted complaints that were once buried in folders marked sensitive, because truth doesn't expire. A passenger, an older man with salt and pepper hair, began to applaud. Then another. Then the entire cabin. Kendra looked up, eyes damp with tears. Jamal tapped his phone. Her speech is going viral. Already 600K views. At Vista Blue headquarters in Chicago, senior management convened in an emergency meeting, a headline flashing across the main screen. CEO Danielle Rhodes addresses passengers in live cabin statement, systemic reform announced. Meanwhile, reporters began to gather at the destination airport. But Danielle wasn't waiting for interviews. As she returned to her seat, the 12-year-old girl handed her a handmade wooden bead bracelet. For you, she said, so you don't forget you helped someone believe. Danielle slipped the bracelet on, said nothing, and simply nodded at the girl's mother. She didn't do this for the media. She didn't do it to reclaim reputation. She did it because 18 years ago, a 10-year-old girl once wished that someday, when she grew up, no child would have to watch their mother be humiliated at a ticket counter. She didn't need applause. She just needed to know that from today on, maybe, just maybe, some child somewhere would lift their head when walking into an airport. Not because they were taught to bow, but because they knew this place was renamed after someone who stood. When the Boeing 737 landed at Denver International Airport, the afternoon sun had already begun to fade. Thin gold light streamed through the Western Terminal's glass walls, where a group of Vista Blue employees stood in formation, waiting to welcome Danielle. There was no red carpet, no cameras. Just people in old uniforms, wearing new badges, the emblem of a tilted ear, designed within 72 hours after her speech, as a quiet pledge. From now on, they would listen, not just to respond, but to change. Danielle didn't rush off the plane. She packed lightly, folding her soft-knit sweater, removing the wooden bead bracelet from her wrist and placing it into the inner pocket of her suitcase. She didn't want to wear it as a symbol of triumph. She kept it as a draft of a future, one where promises were still in progress. On her way out of first class, Jamal handed her an envelope. "Found this under seat 2C. I think it's meant for you." Danielle took it, noticing the soft, slanted handwriting. No return address, just the first line clearly visible. "I was going to file a complaint, but I figured maybe I should write to you instead." She didn't open it right away. Walking through the economy cabin, she nodded gently at each person who had witnessed the story. They didn't take photos, didn't ask for autographs. Some simply placed a hand over their hearts as if to say, "I understand." When Danielle stepped off the plane, the sunlight was already fading. She walked toward the waiting car but didn't get in immediately. She opened the letter. Inside was a single folded sheet, handwritten with few words. It was a story from a former logistics staffer who had quit after being labeled a slow learner. A confession from a trainee flight attendant who had once witnessed a passenger being disrespected but didn't speak up for fear of losing their job. And one sentence at the end: "I didn't stand up when I should have, but if you're still standing, then I will stand next time." Danielle finished reading, folded the letter and placed a hand over her chest. She didn't know the name of the writer, but she knew the guilt was real. And that feeling, not any speech, was what could truly shift the culture of an industry. Danielle got into the car but asked the driver to detour by the Western branch office before taking her to the hotel. It was a small 3-story building that had once been Vista Blue's training center, now being renovated into a community space for staff and their families. When the car arrived, she didn't go in right away, but stopped on the front lawn, where a group of teenagers were repainting a stone wall. One of them, a curly-haired boy, around 19, turned to look at her. "Are you her?" Danielle simply nodded. He handed her a can of paint. She didn't write a slogan, didn't write a title. She wrote a single line in deep blue. "Next time, don't let me be the only one." She set the paint down and looked at the young man. "They'll teach you how to stay quiet, but you're allowed to ask." He nodded, didn't smile. But something had changed in his eyes. That evening, in her hotel room, Danielle sat alone with her tablet. She didn't read the news, didn't replay her speech. She opened an email from the HR department with a simple subject line: "Recognition nomination, unknown passenger." Inside was a formal recommendation to recognize the actions of the anonymous passenger who had spoken up for her on that fateful morning. Someone who didn't know her true identity, but acted not for status, but for what was right. She clicked approve and added a note: "We will remember the unnamed." Near midnight, Danielle reopened her personal journal app, an application she rarely used. She typed a short entry: "I didn't build an empire. I just dusted off a system that had been forgotten. I don't expect to be remembered, but if one day someone is no longer asked, 'Do you have a ticket?' then I'll feel like it was enough." The next morning, at the official press conference in Denver, Danielle didn't give a long speech. She brought the letter from the day before and held it up in front of the cameras. "This is the reason we reform," she said, "not because we want headlines, but because some truths are too heavy to carry alone." As she stepped down from the podium, A reporter called out, "Are you going to fire more people?" Danielle paused, turned back, and answered, "No, we're going to hire people who don't need to be reminded how to be human." On the flight back to Vista Blue headquarters in Chicago, Danielle sat by the window for the first time in years, not opening her laptop. She just looked at the sky. A little boy walking by turned to look at her and whispered, "That's the lady who changed the plane." She didn't correct him. She didn't need anyone to get her title right. Sometimes just changing one seat is enough to change how a child sees the world. When the plane landed, she received a text from her mother. Just one line, "I still remember when you were 10. I was wrong to stay silent. You've corrected that for me." Upon arriving in Chicago, instead of going home, Danielle visited a place she had never mentioned to anyone at the company, a small training center tucked deep in the western suburbs, where she had interned nearly 2 decades ago. Everything looked dated, but on the ash-gray wall in the waiting room, there was still an old photo frame, a group picture of the 2007 staff. In the photo, she stood in the back row, only half her face visible. No one at the company today would recognize her from that picture, and maybe they didn't need to. She sat down on the hard plastic chair beside the vending machine. At that moment, the room was empty. Danielle quietly pulled a new sheet of paper from her coat pocket, the response letter she had written based on the one she received on the plane. But this time, it wasn't addressed to any one person. It was addressed to the next one. "Dear future witness," she wrote, "you don't need to be powerful to do something powerful. You don't need a microphone to speak truth. You only need one moment of courage. That's all it takes. Just one." After signing her name, Danielle folded the letter and slid it into the small gap beneath the old photo frame. Maybe one day someone would find it. Maybe not. But she didn't write it to be answered. She wrote it so no one else would feel alone when they saw something wrong and hadn't yet found the strength to speak. That evening, during the first executive leadership meeting since the incident, Danielle didn't demand investigations or assign blame. She proposed just one thing: change the way training begins, not with policies, but with a question. If your child were the passenger, would you want this employee to serve them? Each person in the room looked at one another. No one answered right away, but one by one they all nodded. She ended the meeting with a single sentence: "Let's not make our future apologize for our present." The next day on Vista Blue's homepage, a post appeared with a background image of a folded paper lying on an airplane tray table. The caption wasn't a PR statement. It simply read, "To the passenger who stood up when no one else did, this company owes you more than a seat." There was no like button, no comment section, just a share button, because some lessons aren't meant to be debated, only passed on. Weeks later, during an orientation session for new Vista Blue staff, the trainer opened with a story. Once there was a woman who wasn't believed to be a first-class passenger. She didn't scream, she didn't sue, she simply stood up and did the work of a decent human being. At the back of the class, a young woman raised her hand and asked, "She's the CEO, right?" The trainer smiled and replied, "That's not the point. She's the reason we don't ask that question anymore." And if you're wondering, did that really happen? The answer doesn't really matter. What matters more is this: it could happen. In a single moment, a woman without shouting, without anger, changed the way an entire industry sees human worth. Not through power, but through belief. If this story made you feel a little warmer knowing kindness still exists, or stirred your anger at how easily injustice is forgiven, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes a simple act of reflection is the gentlest yet most powerful way to take a stand. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, so we don't forget how to listen, how to truly see each other with respect, then hit that subscribe button. Not to support us, but so you won't miss those rare moments when truth and goodness meet. Because who knows, the next video might just be a story you witnessed, or one you needed to hear.